Hey everyone, tonight we start with something that is very hard to understand. The pyramids. Those huge stone triangles in the desert that make everyone say, no way humans built that. That's kind of rude to ancient Egypt. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Of all the mysteries people have made up over the years, like where did I put my keys? Or why did civilizations disappear? The pyramids are something that people have thought about for a long time. These huge limestone triangles that dominate the desert have been there for more than 4,000 years, just sitting there. But still, people today look at them and say, nope, humans didn't do that. Impossible. Bring me the aliens. It's a question that the pyramids refuse to die because they are so huge. They are mathematically perfect. They are older than your whole family tree, your country, your language, and maybe even your sense of style. They give off energy that shouldn't be possible, like a cat following instructions or a grocery cart with all four wheels working. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and look up. It is so big that it makes skyscrapers feel unsafe and unlike. It wasn't built with computer models, cranes, or a construction crew wearing reflective vests and arguing about lunch breaks like modern skyscrapers. It was built with stone tools, sweat, organization, and a level of ancient stubbornness that deserves a global award. And this is why the big question sticks around. How did ancient Egyptians build something this big without modern technology? It haunts people. It taunts people. It lurks in documentaries narrated by men with dramatic voices who refuse to speak at a normal volume. Every year, someone somewhere releases a new theory. Ramps, spirals, water flotation, giants, sound levitation, or the ever popular explanation, something forgotten civilization. Because apparently it is easier for some people to believe in an ancient secret, hyper advanced society that vanished without a trace than to accept that Egyptians were just good at their jobs. But here's the thing. The pyramids weren't miracles, and they weren't. They were engineering, not cosmic mysteries. Brilliant, organized, relentless engineering, powered by tens of thousands of skilled workers who probably just wanted their wages, their bread rations, and a day off that never came. The pyramids have become symbols of mystery, but to the people who built them, they were construction projects. Massive ones, yes. Difficult ones, definitely. But not magical. Just Boss wants a giant stone triangle, so we're making a giant stone triangle. So the real question is not whether humans built the pyramids. It's how ancient Egyptians pulled off one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, one perfectly placed block at a time. Let's clear up the biggest historical misconception right away. The pyramids were not built by enslaved people being whipped under the desert sun by a villainous overseer who looked suspiciously like he belonged in a badly researched Hollywood movie. That version of history survives only because filmmakers love dramatic scenery and someone somewhere said this is close enough, and thousands of people just went along with it. the truth is much more surprising and, to be honest, much more wholesome. The pyramids were built by paid Egyptian workers. Yes, paid as in wages, food rations, housing, time off, medical care, and work crews with supervisors who actually wrote performance reports on pottery shards. It was less slavery and more a huge national construction project run by people who were both committed and a little scared of letting the Pharaoh. These workers weren't random people off the street. They were specialists like quarrymen, engineers, architects, tool makers, bakers, brewers, rope makers, and even professional stone haulers with thighs strong enough to crush a chariot. Many of them came from farming families. The Nile's flood season made farming impossible for part of the year, so instead of sitting at home and complaining about the weather like people do now, they joined rotating labor teams called gangs. Each gang had names like the friends of. Khufu is cute until you remember that the friend was building a pyramid the size of a small mountain. Archaeologists also found worker villages near the pyramids. These were whole neighborhoods with bakeries, barracks, breweries, kitchens, and medical facilities. Workers who died during the project were buried with honors in cemeteries. No one builds a cemetery for enslaved workers. They build one for people they respect. And let's not forget the beer. Workers got rations of bread, onions, and enough beer per day to keep morale high and mild dehydration at bay. This wasn't cheap beer either. It was ancient Egypt's version of an energy drink. Thick, nutritious, and strong enough to make you believe you could actually move a 50-ton stone block. Were conditions easy? Absolutely not. Imagine working construction in a desert wearing linen, hauling limestone under a sun that could melt your hopes. But these weren't disposable laborers. They were skilled, valued, and essential workers in the largest building project on Earth. So no, the pyramids weren't built by slaves. They were built by teams of hard-working Egyptians who probably wondered every day why the pharaoh couldn't have chosen a smaller tomb. If you picture ancient Egyptian architects as men in linen skirts, casually doodling triangle shapes in the sand until something pyramidish emerges, prepare to have your worldview professionally adjusted. The people who designed the pyramids were not guessing. They were not improvising. They were mathematical assassins who vibed their way to world wonders. The planners, scribes, surveyors, architects, and overseers were the elite nerd squad of ancient Egypt. Forget Hogwarts. This was Pappy Warts, where students learned geometry, measurements, astronomy, logistics, and how to keep 2,000 workers from wandering off to take a nap in the shade. The Egyptian didn't use advanced calculators or pocket lasers. They used ropes, shadows, poles, and a lot more geometry than your high school teacher ever hoped to teach. You'd remember, their ropes had knots spaced at precise intervals to measure distances, angles, and layout grids. Meanwhile, your rope at home is tangled, embarrassing, and probably being used as a clothesline. Aligning the Great Pyramid alone required an almost disrespectful level of precision. We're talking alignment to the cardinal directions so accurate that modern surveyors get nervous. Meanwhile, the Egyptians achieved this with nothing but stargazing and sheer confidence. They tracked the movement of circumpolar stars, determined true north through celestial observations, and then said, "Yes, this is fine." As if they hadn't just performed divine level mathematics with a stick, the planners also solved the small issue of building something huge that wouldn't collapse. They used slope ratios, load distribution, internal chambers, relieving blocks, and the basic architectural principle of if this falls down, the pharaoh will be extremely unhappy. So let's not do that. They also mapped out worker. Stars figured out true north by looking at the sky and then said, "Yes, this is fine." It was as if they hadn't just done divine level math with a stick. The planners also figured out how to build something huge that wouldn't fall down. They used slope ratios, load distribution, internal chambers, relieving blocks, and the basic rule of architecture that if this falls down, the pharaoh will be very unhappy. So let's not do that. They also made a map of the workers. Imagine having to design a city, a supply chain, a monument, and a very large triangle all at once. Then being told, you must also finish it before the pharaoh finishes his reign and starts haunting you for being late. Even the placement of the pyramids was intentional. They built on bedrock for stability, near the Nile for transportation, and close to quarries to avoid dragging limestone from the opposite side of the planet. Every decision was calculated, deliberate, and deeply not aligned with the popular idea that they just stacked rocks. These were not random desert triangles. They were planned with brilliance, discipline, and just enough mathematical charisma to survive thousands of years. The pyramids aren't mysteries of construction. They're monuments to ancient Egypt's nerds. And those nerds were unstoppable. If you want to understand how the pyramids were built, you must begin where ancient Egyptian dreams went to die. The quarries. Because before a single block ever touched a ramp, before any engineer with suspiciously good geometry skills drew a single perfect angle, somebody had to cut tens of thousands of stones out of solid bedrock. And trust me, this was not the glamorous part of pyramid construction. This was the welcome to the Bronze Age. Here is your hammer, go cry in the heat part. Most of the limestone for the Great Pyramid came from a quarry that was inconveniently right next to the pyramid site. This was considered lucky, which tells you everything you need to know about ancient construction standards. But even with that short distance, the real challenge was carving gigantic blocks out of rock using none of the tools humans desperately want them to have. No iron saws, no power tools, no divine laser cutters from the star Sirius, just copper chisels, stone hammers, and the sheer determination of thousands of workers who were probably trying not to think too hard about the Egyptian quarrying sounded easy in theory. Chisel lines, pound wedges, crack stone, and remove block. But in reality, it was dusty, loud, and sweaty, and there was so much sand that some workers probably still had grains in their socks when they died. Copper chisels dulled all the time, so blacksmiths were on standby like overworked pit crews at an ancient NASCAR event. The workers would return every hour with tools that had been dulled by stone harder than their will to live. The blacksmith reheated, reshaped, hammered, handed it back, and watched the cycle repeat. The ancient economy ran on bread, beer, and an unreasonable faith in soft metal. For harder stones, like the granite used for the inner chambers, workers went to Aswan, miles upriver. This is where Egyptian patience reached deity level. They used dolerite pounders, which were basically dense, angry rocks, to crush granite into submission. Imagine hitting one countertop with another until one of them gives up. That was the job. Once cut, blocks had to be hauled out of the quarry along prepared tracks. Teams dragged them inch by inch, overseen by men with sticks and enthusiasm, but mostly sticks. The quarries weren't just the beginning of the pyramid, they were the crucible, the place where stone, sweat, and supreme stubbornness fused into the raw material of eternity, moving multi-ton limestone blocks across the desert. Sounds like the kind of job that would need heavy machinery, an engineering degree, and at least 3 drinks to help you feel better. But the ancient Egyptians did it without cranes, trucks, hydraulics, forklifts, or the modern idea of calling someone else to do it. Instead, they relied on what every great civilization secretly runs on: smart engineering, teamwork, and a lot of stubbornness. Let's start with the basics. The blocks did not get rolled on giant wooden logs, contrary to every school book illustration ever. Why? Because Egypt had about 7 trees total, all of which were busy being sacred, royal, or decorative. The idea of wasting precious wood on rolling stones the size of bedrooms was about as likely as Pharaoh issuing free dental care. So, the Egyptians used sledges, giant wooden sleds, onto which the stone blocks were loaded. Workers pulled them using thick ropes, forming long, coordinated teams. And by coordinated, I mean dozens of men shouting at each. Other while trying to move something heavier than their hopes and dreams. But the trick wasn't the pulling, it was the sand. Dry sand is terrible for dragging heavy things. Your sledge sinks, friction skyrockets, and suddenly everything is terrible and everyone wants to go home. So the Egyptians did something genius. They watered the sand. Yes, real science. When you sprinkle water on loose sand, the grains stick together, which makes it much easier to move. Suddenly, the sledge glides across the surface like a smooth ancient cheat code. This wasn't speculation. It's depicted in actual paintings. One worker is always shown pouring water in front of the sledge, looking like he's doing the ancient equivalent of maintenance, while everyone else does the pulling. For longer distances, they used river barges. Massive stone blocks were floated up or down the Nile on wooden boats so sturdy they might as well have signed sponsorship deals. Teams loaded stones at quarry docks, sailed them too. They unloaded them on nearby ramps and then moved them through controlled chaos. Then came the desert hauling, which required rhythmic pulling, coordinated chanting, and enough rope tension to make a modern safety inspector burst into flames. At no point did the Egyptians say, "This is too hard. Let's quit." Instead, they improved the process over generations, making stone transport a national sport. not for fun or glory, but because they had pyramids to build and didn't want to let anyone down. A pharaoh who thought that building things on time would help him in the afterlife. If you've ever used a Stairmaster at the gym and thought, wow, this is torture, let me introduce you to the ancient Egyptians. They built the first and best Stairmaster system in history. Instead of climbing stairs for fitness, they climbed ramps to move huge stones. Instead of a fan blowing in their face, they had a foreman yelling at them to go faster. When people think of building pyramids, they picture ropes, sweat, and maybe 100 men pulling a block. But what they should be picturing is ramps. Ramps everywhere. Ramps that crossed the desert like traffic jams in ancient Egypt. Ramps that went straight, sideways, zigzagging, spiraling, and sometimes made architects stare at their own sketches and say, this is fine. This is definitely fine. Why ramps? Because ancient Egyptians knew one simple truth. It's easier to drag a stone up a. It was easier to float it into the sky using alien Wi-Fi than to walk up a slope. There were a few main types of ramps, and each one was its own kind of misery. The straight ramp, the original classic, was a long, thick, brutally steep ramp made of mud brick, limestone chippings, and crushed hopes. It ran directly up one side of the pyramid. It worked well at first, but as the pyramid got taller, the ramp had to grow so long that it could theoretically reach another city. It also blocked the face of the pyramid, which architects hated. The zigzag ramp looks like someone saw the straight ramp and said, what if the workers needed more steps? The spiral ramp was for the architect who wanted the workers to suffer, but in a more creative way. This ramp wrapped around the pyramid as it rose like a snake. It turned dragging stone into a cardio workout so intense it should have come with free electrolytes. Giant sandstone unicorn horn, great for getting up high, but not so great for seeing. Block haulers kept running into each other like confused mountain goats. And the real genius was that they kept changing the ramps as the pyramid grew. Build higher, extend the ramp. Build higher, adjust again. Workers didn't just build the pyramid, they built the thing that let them build the pyramid. It was construction inside construction, like a nightmare inside a bigger nightmare. But here's the thing, the ramps worked. Without treadmills, lifting belts, or even a gym membership. If you picture the pyramid workforce as a chaotic mob of half-starved slaves collapsing in the sun while an overseer screams, faster, congratulations. You've seen too many Hollywood movies. The real world was much more impressive, and to be honest, more fun. The pyramid workforce was organized chaos, with a lot of organization and just a little bit of chaos for flavor. First, the workers weren't slaves. They were paid workers, skilled craftsmen, seasonal workers, and farmers who picked up extra work during the Nile flooding season. Think of them as ancient Egypt's version of construction workers, unionized farmers, and part-time dads who got bored sitting at home. They even lived in special workers' towns with bakeries, breweries, clinics, and barracks. Yes, clinics, because you can't build a literal mountain of stone without someone smashing a finger every 14 minutes. These workers were divided into teams called gangs, each proudly naming themselves things like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunk but Determined Crew, names that sound suspiciously like modern intramural sports teams. Every gang had its own hierarchy: supervisors, team leads, and scribes tracking who did what. Imagine someone spending 8 hours a day writing. Amenhotep moved 3 blocks. Kenru moved 2 blocks and then complained about his back. They had cooks preparing tens of thousands of loaves of bread per day, brewers making, vats of beer, and butchers working with cattle so often that the butcher's area looked like a grocery store from the Bronze Age without refrigeration. By the way, beer was part of the workers' daily ration. It kept them hydrated and boosted their morale. The ancient Egyptians basically came up with the idea of drinking on the job. There were different levels of workers. There were skilled stone cutters, elite specialists, haulers, who were the muscle who dragged blocks with ropes, riggers, who coordinated lifts and pulls, and water carriers, whose job was to keep the workers hydrated. Everyone was there, smoothing sand for sledges. And finally, the supervisors, who were in charge of pointing dramatically and saying, "Lift it. No, higher." The system worked shockingly well, even though it was on a large scale. Workers rotated shifts, teams competed for efficiency, and injuries were treated. They had medical records showing healed bones and long-term care. This was not a disposable workforce. It was a national treasure of manpower, logistics, and questionable ancient motivational speeches. Was it exhausting? Yes, it was. Was it chaotic? Yes, it was. But it was organized chaos, the kind that builds a monument so massive that people thousands of years later insist it must have been aliens. The workers didn't just build pyramids, they built one of history's greatest case studies in teamwork. You don't pull multi-tonon limestone blocks across the desert on an empty stomach. The ancient Egyptians understood this deeply, perhaps too deeply, because the pyramid builders were fueled by a diet that can only be described as carbs, more carbs, onions, and enough beer to stun a camel. Let's start with bread, the backbone of the ancient Egyptian food pyramid, which ironically powered the actual pyramids. Workers received rations of thick, heavy loaves that were basically ancient protein bars if protein bars were made of wheat, grit, and enough calories to keep a human dragging stones from sunrise to sunset. This bread wasn't soft or fluffy. It was durable, indestructible. Some archaeologists have found bread so hard it could probably become a construction material. Then we have onions, mountains of onions, entire fields dedicated to fueling workers with this pungent miracle bulb. Why onions? Because they were cheap, grown everywhere, and in the Egyptian worldview, full of spiritual protection. And also because onions are dense in calories and electrolytes, turning each worker into a surprisingly efficient, if extremely fragrant, labor machine. Next up, dried fish, salty, chewy, and stored in quantities that suggest the Nile was serving an all-you-can-eat buffet. The fish gave people protein to help their muscles heal. Since these workers were basically human forklifts, Muscle repair was a must. Some modern reconstructions say that the average pyramid worker burned more than 4,000 calories a day. The fish didn't taste great, but it kept people alive long enough to keep pulling. And then we got to the star of the menu, the liquid MVP, the fuel that made everything possible. Beer. Not modern, crisp. No, ancient Egyptian beer was thick, bready, and nutritious. It was more like a drinkable loaf than a drink. Workers drank about 4 liters of it per person per day. It was good for hydration, nutrition, and probably motivation. We can't prove that tipsy workers built the pyramids, but we can't rule it out either. Imagine hauling a stone block the size of a small car after your 3rd liter of breakfast beer. It makes sense why ancient Egyptians did it, depicted their gods with animal heads. After enough ancient beer, everything probably looked like that. Despite the jokes, this diet was carefully engineered. High calories, high carbs, enough salts to survive the heat, and constant liquid intake. It was the world's first state-sponsored mass catering program, a prehistoric cafeteria designed to keep thousands of workers constructing the most iconic stone structures on Earth. Bread, onions, fish, and beer. Not glamorous, not elegant, but undeniably effective. The pyramids go from being an impressive engineering project to being just showing off. The Great Pyramid isn't just big, it's also very old. It's so precise that even modern engineers sometimes look at it like it just insulted their degree. For example, the Great Pyramid is perfectly aligned with true north, which is so precise that you'd think the builders had a satellite, a laser, and a very patient surveyor. But no, they had sticks, string, and the sky, and yet they aligned the entire structure within a fraction of a degree of the planet's actual north-south axis. Today we have compasses, GPS, and apps that tell you which direction to face while cooking noodles. They had the sun and an attitude of close enough, except their close turned out to be mathematically ridiculous. Then there's the leveling. The base of the Great Pyramid sits on a platform so perfectly flat that it makes modern construction sites look like someone eyeballed everything after. Lunch. The whole base is less than the width of your thumb across a surface the size of several football fields. Not bad for people who don't have bulldozers, lasers, or the ability to yell, "We're off level," while waving a digital level around. And the sides, oh, the sides, each one is almost exactly the same length. We're talking variations in millimi. Millimi. This is the kind of precision you expect from a Swiss watchmaker, not a civilization that carved stone with. They used copper chisels and geometry taught by priests who also did embalming on the weekends. How did they do it? Very carefully, with a level of teamwork and patience that no modern group project has. They used ropes, grids, plumb bobs, water trenches, the movement of the stars, and good old-fashioned stubbornness. When something wasn't right, they fixed it. When a block didn't line up, they moved it. No shortcuts. No good enough. No, we'll fix it in post-production. And maybe the funniest part is that none of this was done for tourists, future archaeologists, or the approval of conspiracy theorists. They weren't trying to impress us. They built with this level of precision because their religion demanded perfection and because no one wanted to be the guy responsible for the slightly crooked pyramid. So, yes, the Great Pyramid's precision seems impossible, but the builders weren't aiming for possible. They were aiming for eternal, and they hit the mark. Moving the stone box to the pyramid was impressive, but the real fun began when they put the stones in place. Once they got to the construction site, they were dragged across the desert on sledges by teams of workers who were sometimes yelled at by supervisors who took their jobs too seriously. The next challenge was lifting the multi-ton blocks up an ever-growing staircase of limestone. And remember, there were no pulleys, cranes, or forklifts driven by a guy named Dave. Just levers, teamwork, and a lot of determination, fueled mostly by beer and spite. The first tool they used was a lever, a simple wooden beam wedged under the edge of a block and pulled down to lift it up. This is the same principle used today to open stubborn jars, flip tables dramatically, or get something you regret out from under the fridge. Workers wedged the lever under the stone, lifted it a few centimeters, slid small stones underneath, and then did it again. Lift, wedge, lift, wedge. This was the ancient equivalent of. Someone kept hitting the snooze button, but it was much heavier and didn't promise sleep. Then came the sledges, which were used not only for dragging things horizontally, but also for short, controlled vertical adjustments. Teams placed the block at the edge of the ramp or pyramid layer and relied on coordinated pulling, guiding ropes, and a lot of grunting. Supervisors stood nearby and gave helpful advice like, "Pull harder," "No, harder," and "Are you even trying?" The stones didn't magically click into position. They were coaxed like stubborn cats. Each block was adjusted with smaller stones, acting as temporary supports, nudged gently with wooden mallets, and aligned with string grids stretched across the entire pyramid structure. And by string grids, we mean one worker holding a rope and squinting intensely while insisting he was perfectly straight. The most astonishing part, these blocks fit together with such tight precision that not even a knife blade can slip between them today. That means every time a block was slightly crooked, a team of tired workers had to fix it over and over until the overseer said, "Yes, that'll do," or gave up pretending he could tell the difference. And as the pyramid grew taller, so did the difficulty. Workers had to haul stones up ramps, lift them into place, and adjust them under brutal sun, swirling dust, and desert heat that absolutely did not care for their well-being. The fact that this process was repeated millions of times is the real miracle, not aliens, not lost super, technology, just pure human strength, geometry, and the unwavering ancient Egyptian commitment to saying higher. If the outside of the pyramids is impressive, the inside is where ancient Egyptian architects basically leaned over to the future and whispered, "Good luck figuring this out." Because while most people imagine pyramids as giant stone triangles with nothing going on inside, the truth is the opposite. They are stuffed with corridors, chambers, shafts, hidden passageways, and architectural decisions that scream. We're geniuses, but we're also a little dramatic. Let's start with the king's chamber. It's a room made entirely of huge granite blocks that were quarried from Aswan, which is more than 500 meters away. Each granite beam weighs between 50 and 80 tons, which is about the size of a small whale or a big argument. And somehow, the Egyptians moved them across the country, up ramps, and into the center of the pyramid without using cranes, forklifts, or a group chat called Granite Squad. How did they do it? With ramps, platforms, and an attitude of relentless optimism. They probably made angled ramps that spiraled or zigzagged up inside the building. These ramps let workers pull the beams horizontally instead of lifting them straight up, which is good because lifting an 80-ton block straight up is the kind of thing that makes engineers lie down and rethink their life choices. Once inside the chamber area, the real magic happened. Teams used levers, rollers, sledges, and a lot of shouting to move each granite block into place with millimeter level precision. No hydraulics, no steel, just physics, determination, and the ancient Egyptian version of coworker pressure. But the crowning achievement, the thing that makes modern engineers mutter, okay, that's actually insane, is the system of relieving chambers above the king's chamber. These stacked rooms, separated by massive stone beams, redistributed the weight of the pyramid so the chamber wouldn't collapse under the millions of tons of stone above it. It's basically an ancient shock absorber system, or the world's first "this building shall not crush the pharaoh insurance policy." The brilliance is that the Egyptians didn't just build a chamber, they built a chamber with layers of architectural armor. Each relieving chamber absorbed stress, diverted pressure, and kept the ceiling from doing the one thing a ceiling should never do: fall. So, yes, ancient Egyptians mastered structural load distribution long before anyone walked into an engineering lecture and heard the phrase compressive stress. These people didn't just build monuments, they built puzzles that modern experts still argue about. And the best part is that they made it look easy. If you picture pyramid builders living in tents, chewing on sand, and collapsing in the desert, while someone with eyeliner shouts orders, please throw that image straight into the Nile. The daily life around the Giza construction area looked more like a busy industrial town. It was ancient, dusty, a little chaotic, but surprisingly well managed. They didn't live in the middle of nowhere. They lived in a workers' village that was built just for them. It had straight streets, bakeries, breweries, kitchens, barracks, storage houses, and even neighborhoods. It was like a company town in the Bronze Age, but with more sun and fewer vacation days. The bakeries alone were making bread on an industrial scale with mountains of dough. Archaeologists found huge communal ovens that were so blackened from use that they looked like they had been personally scorched by Ra himself. And the bread wasn't the dainty artisan loaf you see on Instagram. This was dense, brick-like calorie bomb bread designed to fuel a human engine dragging multi-ton-on stones uphill. And the beer, let's just say OSHA would have had concerns. Workers drank around 4 liters of beer per day, which is absolutely a health hazard in the modern world, but was considered hydration with benefits in ancient Egypt. The beer was thick, nutritious, and mildly alcoholic. the perfect combination for a civilization that built wonders and probably had incredible tolerance. The workers' village also had butcheries where cattle, sheep, and goats were processed to feed the massive workforce. Ancient Egyptians weren't starving on the job. They were eating meat, onions, fish, bread, and enough carbs to power the entire Philadelphia Eagles offensive line. And then there's the medical care. Yes, real medical care. Archaeologists found skeletons with bone fractures that healed perfectly straight, which means someone at the site was like an ancient orthopedic surgeon. People with broken arms and legs weren't just thrown away. They were treated, rested, and then sent back to work when they were better. That's more than what most modern employers can say. The village wasn't just efficient, it was also social. Workers ate together, slept in the same room, joked, fought, shared gossip, and probably complained about their bosses, just like every work site in history. The walls even have graffiti, carving team names like the Friends of Khufu, which sounds less like a work crew and more like an ancient bowling league. Daily life wasn't glamorous, but it wasn't miserable either. It was organized, structured, human, and it powered the greatest construction project the world has ever seen. If you came here expecting ancient Egyptians to whip out laser cutters, diamond saws, or some mysterious alien toolkit shaped like a glowing USB stick, I regret to inform you, their tools were hilariously so simple that if you gave them to a modern construction worker, he would stare at you, stare at the tool, and then file a complaint with HR. But here's the twist: the Egyptians didn't need advanced technology. Their brilliance came not from what they used, but how they used it. Their toolkit included copper chisels, wooden mallets, stone pounders, wooden sledges, and dolerite balls, which are basically fist-sized cannonballs made of. These dolerite pounders were used to bash limestone blocks into shape, not carve, not shave, but bash with full force day after day until the stone gave up from exhaustion. Copper chisels were softer than the stone they were hitting, so they had to be constantly resharpened. Imagine being a pyramid worker, chiseling for 10 minutes, and then walking all the way back to the blacksmith like, "Hey, yeah, it's dull again." And the blacksmith sighs, because he has sharpened that exact chisel about 19,000 times this month. They used wooden mallets to hit the chisels. They were simple, effective, and great for building pyramids and letting off steam at work. Every swing of the mallet was like therapy. Every hit of the chisel said, "This pharaoh better appreciate this." Then there were the stone pounders. These were used by the more enthusiastic workers. Their job was to smash the limestone blocks until they got the right shape. Archaeologists have found piles of broken dolerite balls, which means that some workers really went for it. It was like someone going to the gym every day and deciding that every day is arm day. But the real genius wasn't the tool itself, it was the method. Egyptians used grids, red ochre guidelines, plumb lines made from string, and levels based on water trenches. With nothing but simple geometry, good eyesight, and a terrifying amount of patience, they achieved accuracy that today's contractors would blame on the machine. They did most of the work. Their tools were simple, but their techniques were beautiful, and their craftsmanship was legendary. They didn't need alien technology. They had skill, discipline, and the determination of the whole group to finish the pharaoh's huge cosmic flex. At some point in this story, a very reasonable question comes to mind. Why? Why build something so big? Why drag millions of stone blocks across the hot desert? Why put decades of national effort into a triangular mountain that doesn't really have a gift shop? Well, ancient Egypt had several answers. And depending on which one you focus on, the pyramids start to look either spiritual, political, or like the world's earliest recorded case of my dynasty is bigger than your dynasty. First, religion. The ancient Egyptian afterlife was not a casual concept. It was a full-time high-budget production, and the pharaoh was the star of the show. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a resurrection machine, a giant stone launch pad meant to shoot the shape of the pyramid was like the rays of the sun leading the pharaoh's spirit to join the gods. It was like spiritual infrastructure. Second, politics. You have to remember that pharaohs were not elected officials. They were absolute rulers with unlimited ambition and a real fear of being forgotten. A pyramid was not just a building, it was a message. It said, "My kingship is eternal. No one else has as much power as I do." Is, please stop making plans against me. I literally built a mountain. Building a pyramid told rival elites, citizens, and neighboring states that the pharaoh had complete control over labor, resources, logistics, and geology. It was like a political billboard, but instead of being 20 feet tall, it was 480 feet tall and could be seen from space. Third, legacy and flexing. Let's be honest. Pharaohs like to show off. If you ruled a superpower with divine status and a god complex, wouldn't you want to build something huge? The Great Pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement piece. It was a monument that said, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and maybe bring a measuring tape, because these dimensions are crazy." Building huge pyramids also brought the country together. Workers were fed, housed, paid, and cared for. Farmers had jobs during the Nile flood season. Industries boomed to supply the construction. The Pyramid Project wasn't just a tomb, it was a national economic project. A huge stone triangle that looked like a stimulus package. In short, pyramids were about religion, politics, legacy, engineering, and the ultimate desert flex. And somehow, thousands of years later, the message still stands, literally. In medieval Europe, the open road was less a pathway between towns and more a hunting ground where danger followed every step. Travelers feared the shadowed woods not because of wild animals, though wolves and boars existed, but because of something far worse, men who behaved. Highwaymen were just like predators. They earned the creepy name wolves of the road for a reason. They worked with patience, strategy, and a ruthless understanding of how scared people were. Every pilgrim on their way to a holy shrine, every merchant hauling goods, and every messenger carrying sealed letters knew that outside the city walls, law and civilization were thin. And where the law was thin, the hunters waited. Medieval authorities just couldn't control the area. There weren't many patrols, the roads were in bad shape, and the forests were thick enough to hide entire gangs. Bandits knew the land better than soldiers. They mapped out ambush points, narrow crossings where a wagon couldn't turn, sharp bends where a rider's sight disappeared, bridges where the sound of hooves covered the rustling of blades, and old Roman roads that had cracked with overgrowth. Travelers might walk for hours without seeing another person, except for the one who wanted their purse. What set these highwaymen apart from regular thieves wasn't just there, kept up, and the forests were so thick that they could hide whole gangs. Bandits knew the land better than soldiers did. They mapped ambush points, narrow crossings where a wagon couldn't turn, sharp bends where a rider's sight disappeared, bridges where the sound of hooves covered the rustling of blades, and old Roman roads that were cracked with overgrowth. Travelers could walk for hours without seeing another person, except for the one who wanted their purse. What set these highwaymen apart from regular thieves was not just there. The violence and the way they organized themselves were terrifying. Some worked alone, but the most feared groups worked together in packs, using whistles or bird calls to communicate. Scouts sat in tree branches and watched dust clouds rise from caravans that were getting closer. Others pretended to be friendly travelers and blended in with pilgrims just long enough to figure out who had money, relics, silk, spices, or letters that were worth ransoming. When the strike came, it was quick and decisive. A fallen tree blocked the way, and a rope snapped tight around a dagger pressed into a horse's throat. The message was always the same: comply or die unseen. Even nobles weren't safe. Many lords traveled with guards, but bandits had spies in taverns who listened for gossip about wealthy caravans leaving at dawn. Some gangs even had informants inside monasteries and markets who traded information for a cut of the loot. If a noble carried coin or fine fabrics, the highwayman would know before the noble even saddled his horse. In this world, fear ruled the roads, and the wolves of the road thrived because they understood one fundamental truth. In medieval Europe, the journey itself was often more dangerous than the destination. If medieval travelers feared anything more than the highwaymen themselves, it was the terrain that helped them. Europe's geography was an accomplice to banditry. Dense forests, mountain passes, marshlands, and abandoned Roman roads created natural choke points where a traveler's fate could be sealed in seconds. And the bandits knew every inch. They weren't just robbers, they were experts at fighting in the woods. The Black Forest, Sherwood, and the Carpathian foothills were the worst places for them. Travelers said they could hear twigs snapping behind them, leaves crunching softly, and the creepy feeling that someone was watching them. And they usually were. Bandits sat in trees like sentinels, watching the horses and wagons go by. From up high, they could see purses bulging, hear gossip about where the travelers were going, and decide if they were worth the risk. Mountain passes were no safer. Thieves in the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the Balkans used height to their advantage. A single rock slide, often intentionally triggered, could trap an entire caravan between vertical cliffs. With nowhere to run, the victims faced a brutal truth. The highwaymen were above them, aiming arrows or rolling weighted stones. Even a small gang of 4 or 5 men could freeze a group of 20 in place through sheer positional superiority. Then there were the forgotten Roman roads, once symbols of imperial order, now crumbling corridors of danger. Over time, weeds, vines, and roots split the stones, turning the paths into uneven hazards. But the old roaded still forest travelers into predictable routes. Bandits loved these. A fallen milestone became cover. An overgrown archway became a perfect hiding spot. The wilderness had swallowed the empire, but bandits had learned to thrive in the ruins of that swallowed world. The danger wasn't always a sudden attack. Sometimes it was a slow tightening of the noose. Travelers would notice unnatural quiet, no bird song, no distant voices. Then they'd spot something odd. A broken wagon abandoned in the middle of the road, or a leather purse left on a stump as bait. Some cautious travelers turned back immediately. Others hesitated too long. That hesitation was all the bandits needed. In these landscapes, nature didn't merely hide the highwaymen. The environment itself, became a weapon, turning entire regions of medieval Europe into ambush country, where the line between a safe journey and a fatal mistake was terrifyingly thin. While lone highwaymen occasionally lurked along medieval roads, the true terror came from organized gangs, groups bound not by loyalty or honor, but by survival, greed, and necessity. These were brotherhoods formed in the shadows, where each member understood one rule above all: trust no one except the man whose blade protects your back. In a world where kings relied on armored knights, bandit gangs created their own version of hierarchy, discipline, and brutal efficiency. Most gangs were made up of desperate men, runaway serfs fleeing impossible taxes, failed mercenaries abandoned after wars ended, deserters avoiding execution, and criminals who believed the hangman's rope was already waiting. But within this mix of outcasts, certain figures inevitably rose to power. The captain, usually the most cunning or most violent, commanded respect through fear and charisma. His word decided who lived, who died, and how the spoils were divided. Bandit gangs were not chaotic mobs slashing wildly in the dark. Their robberies were planned operations. Some members served as scouts, blending into taverns to listen for rumors about wealthy merchants or nobles on the move. Others specialized in ambush engineering, felling trees without noise, preparing tripwires, or setting up false signals designed to lure travelers into dead ends. A few acted as. During robberies, some gang members acted as negotiators, calmly making threats, while others held weapons to the victim's throat. The rules for each gang were different. Some were very strict and didn't kill anyone who wasn't necessary, hurt women, or cheat other members. Others were completely ruthless and saw murder as part of the job. But they all had the same plan: strike quickly and disappear even faster. As soon as a robbery was over, the gangs scattered into the forest like smoke. Soldiers who chased them often found only footprints leading into endless woods. Many gangs set up hidden camps deep in forests, sometimes with traps, pits, and makeshift palisades to make them stronger. These camps were only temporary and could be easily abandoned when things got too hot. Some were so well hidden that hunters walked right past them, not knowing they were just a few steps away from a dozen armed men. Bandit brotherhoods also made temporary alliances when a particularly valuable caravan passed through. Rival gangs might join forces to capture royal messengers, silk caravans, or money chests bound for abbeys. Once the loot was shared, often unequally, the alliances dissolved, sometimes violently. To medieval authorities, these gangs were less like criminals and more like guerrilla forces, unpredictable, elusive, and terrifyingly effective. Their cooperation turned isolated robberies into coordinated campaigns of fear, making the bandit brotherhoods of Europe infamous long before their names ever reached a city gate. A medieval highwayman didn't rely solely on brute force. He relied on fear, the invisible weapon that struck victims long before any blade did. Their physical arms were simple, often crude, but devastating in close quarters. Most bandits favored short swords, hand axes, cudgels, and long knives. Weapons easy to conceal, fast to swing, and cheap to replace. Bows were common too, especially among former hunters or soldiers, giving gangs the means to halt travelers from a distance. A single arrow landing in the dirt near a rider's horse was often. He used fear as a weapon, which struck victims long before any blade did. Their physical arms were simple and often crude, but they were deadly up close. Most bandits used short swords, hand axes, cudgels, and long knives. These were easy to hide, quick to swing, and cheap to replace. Bows were also common, especially among former hunters or soldiers, giving gangs the means to stop travelers from a distance. A single arrow landing in the dirt near a rider's horse was often enough to scare them off, enough to stop a caravan right away. But the real danger wasn't what they carried, it was how they used it. Highwaymen were great at coordinated attacks that caught their victims off guard before they could fight back. One common tactic was the roadblock and pincer, where a fallen tree or cart forced travelers to stop while attackers came out from both sides. Others preferred silent takedowns, tripping a rider with a rope, pulling him off the saddle, and putting a dagger to his neck before he could scream. Scream. Psychological manipulation played an even bigger role. Bandits understood human fear so thoroughly that many of their victims gave up before a weapon was even drawn. Some gangs carved symbols into trees, crude wolf heads, skulls, or slashed crosses, signaling to travelers that they had entered claimed hunting territory. The symbols alone made horses skittish and pilgrims whisper prayers. Then there were false cries for help. A bandit would lie on the road pretending to be a wounded traveler. When a kind-hearted pilgrim got off his horse to help, the injured man whistled sharply, and the gang burst out of the bushes. Medieval chroniclers often complained that showing kindness on the open road was dangerous. Bandits also used sound and light to their advantage. Dusk and dawn were the best times to attack because long shadows made shapes look different and made it hard for people to tell friend from foe. At night, the thieves used rattling chains or animal calls to confuse their victims, making them think wolves, or the bandits used superstition to their advantage. It was much easier to control a traveler who thought the forest was haunted. Even after a robbery, the gang continued their psychological warfare. They sometimes let a few victims go on purpose, scaring them so much that they would tell stories about it to people in nearby towns. These stories, which were often exaggerated in panic, served the bandits' purpose. They spread fear on the road long before the bandits themselves showed up. For the highwaymen, mastering fear was as important as mastering steel. Their weapons hurt, but their strategies won. On medieval roads, danger didn't discriminate, but it did have favorites. Some travelers were easy targets, like treasure chests wrapped in cloaks and prayers. Others were just unlucky souls who crossed a bandit's path at the wrong time. Each type of traveler faced its own unique nightmare. Pilgrims were the easiest prey. They traveled long distances, often on foot, carrying donations, relics, or coins for inns and the pilgrims' simple clothes didn't offer much protection, and their devotion made them easy to predict. They tended to follow well-known holy paths, and highwaymen mapped those paths with deadly accuracy. Bandits knew exactly where pilgrims would stop to rest, where they would meet, and where they would naturally slow down to pray. Some gangs even pretended to be fellow pilgrims, walking with their victims for hours before revealing their blades. Merchants faced a different kind of fear. For a bandit, a merchant wagon was like a rolling vault. It carried bales of cloth, barrels of salted fish, sacks of spices, wine, beeswax, and leather goods. Everything could be sold again. Even the animals that pulled the carts could be stolen and sold. Merchants often hired guards, but guards could be bribed, outnumbered, or ambushed. Even worse, people in marketplaces talked too much. A single overheard brag about valuable goods heading north could ruin an entire caravan. Once marked, merchants became hunted prey long before their wheels ever touched the forest roads. Nobles, despite their wealth, faced a uniquely humiliating danger. A noble caught by highwaymen risked ransom, mockery, and sometimes death. Bandits recognized aristocratic fabrics, jewelry, and signet rings instantly. Some gangs made a sport of stripping nobles of their finery and forcing them to walk home barefoot, their dignity shattered. Others preferred ransom, knowing a baron's family would pay handsomely to retrieve him. But if resistance was shown, or the noble was, the bandits' revenge could be very cruel, especially when it came to ordinary peasants and travelers who had nothing. Bandits didn't believe that a poor man was really poor. To them, a small pouch of grain or a cheap wooden rosary was like hidden treasure. Many peasants lost the little they had, like a loaf of bread, a wool cloak, or even their boots. For them, the robbery wasn't just scary, it was life-threatening. If they lost their supplies, they would go hungry, freeze at night, or die. Impossible journey home. On the medieval road, Victims didn't just lose money, they lost security, dignity, and sometimes the very faith that had sent them traveling in the first place. For all their cunning and brutality, highwaymen were not unchallenged. Medieval authorities, though often slow and underfunded, eventually struck back. Their response wasn't a single, unified system. It was a patchwork of sheriffs, town militias, mounted patrols, and in desperate times hired mercenaries who hunted bandits for money. Each group had its own ways of doing things, its own limits, and its own problems. Sheriffs and bailiffs were usually the first line of defense. They were responsible for more than just towns. They also had to patrol the countryside, but their power was limited. A sheriff could issue warrants, raise a posse, or follow a trail of tracks into the woods. But most of them didn't have enough men to chase organized gangs across miles of wilderness. Many sheriffs were older men who were better at collecting taxes than fighting. They understood the political pressure, though. Travelers wanted safer roads, merchants threatened to stay away from certain areas, and nobles complained loudly when they were ransomed. So the sheriff rode out, knowing that the bandits he was looking for might outnumber his men by 3 to 1. Town and village militias added muscle when the danger got too big. These were not professional soldiers, but blacksmiths, farmers, carpenters, and apprentices armed with spears or wood axes. When caravans went missing or a gang terrorized a popular route, the Lord called on his people to clean the roads. The results were mixed. Sometimes the militia caught the thieves off guard and overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. Other times, the bandits disappeared into the forest before the militia even got there. The villagers went home tired, angry, and often mocked for not being able to stop ghosts. Then there were the mercenary hunters, the most dangerous enemy bandits could face. Kings, wealthy merchants, and powerful abbots hired these men during times of extreme banditry. Many were hardened veterans from recent wars, comfortable in chainmail, and skilled with bow and blade. Unlike sheriffs, they weren't bound by legal niceties. Their orders were simple: track the gang, corner them, and make an example. Some mercenaries returned to towns with severed bandit heads on their saddles to collect payment. Their presence terrified highwaymen, forcing many gangs to scatter, relocate, or turn against one another in paranoia. But despite these efforts, the authorities always faced one crippling. The bandits chose when and where to fight. Forests, valleys, and abandoned ruins were better for ambushes than for uniformed patrols, and corruption made everything worse. Some sheriffs took bribes, some nobles secretly hired bandits, and some mercenaries became bandits themselves after their contracts ended. The battle for the roads was never won permanently. Every time authorities pushed back, the bandits retreated, regrouped, and returned, proving that in medieval Europe, order and law were always. Temporary visitors. When medieval authorities finally caught a highwayman, justice did not arrive quietly. It arrived loudly, publicly, and theatrically, because punishment wasn't only about retribution. It was about sending a message to every traveler, every would-be bandit, and every frightened village. This is What happens to wolves of the road, the execution ground, became a stage and the condemned man the warning sign. Hangings were the most common fate. Bandits were often executed at crossroads, city gates, or at tops small, hills visible from the main roads. These weren't chosen randomly. Travelers were meant to see the bodies swinging in the wind. Chroniclers describe lines of corpses left until they rotted, their bones clacking together like grisly wind chimes. It was crude psychological warfare aimed at discouraging future criminals. But to some hardened bandits, a hanging corpse simply proved the risk of the profession, not a deterrent. Gibbets made the spectacle even more terrifying. A G was an iron cage where a bandit's dead or sometimes barely living body was placed and left to decay. Crows circled above, feeding on the remains, while people whispered the thief's story to one another. A gibbet could remain for years, rusting beside a road, reminding generations of travelers of crimes long extinguished. Children grew up staring at the cage, told that the road wolves ended their lives inside it. For especially violent gangs, authorities reserved harsher punishments. Dismemberment, branding, or breaking on the wheel were used too. This criminal had done more than just steal. He had broken the law so badly that his death needed to be memorable. Branding a surviving bandit's cheek or forehead marked him permanently, making sure that no village or tavern would ever welcome him again. These branded men often went back to the forests and joined new gangs out of necessity, feeding the very cycle that authorities tried to stop. But justice wasn't always fair. False accusations were common. A traveler found with a dagger and a purse of coins could be mistaken for a robber, especially if no one spoke for him. Some lords executed peasants merely to prove they were enforcing the law, and corruption ran deep. A wealthy bandit could bribe his way to freedom, while a desperate beggar might hang for stealing a loaf. Despite the brutality, medieval justice never fully conquered road crime. For every body suspended at a crossroads, two more outlaws seemed to take up the fallen man's path. Public punishment created fear, but it also forged legends, turning common criminals into grim folk heroes, whispered about long after their bones were dust. Not every highwayman vanished into an unmarked grave or rotted in a gibbet. Some escaped the ropes of justice, not by cunning or steel alone, but through transformation from criminal to legend. Medieval Europe loved stories, and the darker the figure, the brighter his myth became. Across villages and taverns, ballads turned thieves into rebels, murderers into avengers, and road wolves into folk heroes whose deeds were exaggerated with every retelling. Robin Hood is the most well-known example, but his true story is hidden in bits and pieces of outlaw ballads and medieval court records. His legend grew because it gave people what they wanted, a hero who stole from the rich, made fun of corrupt sheriffs, and protected the weak. In a time when authority was often cruel and justice was unfair, people wanted to believe such a man existed, and so they did. But Robin Hood was not the only one. In Germany, the Schwarzehunze stories told of a highwayman who targeted cruel lords and spared poor travelers. In France, ballads celebrated Lulu, the wolf of the Ardennes, said to move through forests with supernatural silence. In Eastern Europe, tales of outlaws like Fekete Pal painted them as romantic rebels resisting tyrannical nobles. None of these men were saints. Most were hardened killers, yet their legends softened them, stripping away brutality and replacing it with righteousness. What fueled these transformations? Resentment. Peasants and townspeople were crushed by taxes, tithes, and hungry winters. Bandit stories gave them a fantasy of justice, someone striking back against the powerful. Even clergy contributed to the myth-making. A priest might condemn outlaws from the pulpit, but he couldn't stop parishioners from whispering admiration around hearths at night. Some legends grew because bandits themselves manipulated their image. Outlaws who spared certain travelers or shared a fraction of their loot earned reputations as noble thieves. Others cultivated fear, spreading rumors that they commanded spirits, wolves, or forest demons. Fear kept victims obedient or kept informants silent. Ironically, the harsher authorities punished highwaymen, the stronger their legends grew. A bandit hanged at a crossroads became a symbol either of justice or of rebellion. Stories embellished his final moments, how bravely he stood, how boldly he cursed a corrupt sheriff, how he smiled as the noose tightened. In the medieval imagination, the outlaw, once as a man and forever as a myth, the wolves of the road never fully disappeared. They simply evolved, adapted, or retreated into new corners of society. Banditry wasn't just a criminal profession, it was a symptom of a world where poverty, war, corruption, and isolation constantly collided. Consider the root of the problem. Medieval life was fragile, a failed harvest, a brutal lord, unpaid soldiers after a war. Any disaster could turn ordinary men into outlaws. A plowman who couldn't feed his family had two bleak choices: starve or steal. A veteran dismissed without pay after a campaign might find himself wandering with nothing but his sword. Men like these didn't become bandits out of ambition. They became bandits out of necessity, and necessity is hard to make illegal. Even when authorities built better roads or made taverns that helped thieves illegal, bandits found ways to get around them. They changed routes, tactics, and learned to strike at night or in smaller groups. Many blended into the societies around them, working as porters, laborers, or guards by day, and quietly planning robberies by night. The line between criminal and civilian was thin, and authorities often learned this too late. The very landscape made the problem worse. Europe was huge. There were thick forests, abandoned ruins, wide open plains, and endless mountain passes that made it hard for the law to get to them. A sheriff might clear one valley of thieves, only to have the same gang show up 15 miles away, unharmed and more determined than ever. No matter how many were hanged, beaten, or hunted down by mercenaries, the roads always brought in more. There was also the economic truth. Being a bandit paid well. A single successful robbery could earn more than a month's honest work. capturing a noble might, bring in a ransom worth a year's wages. The temptation was immense, especially for men who believed their lives would never improve. And ironically, the legends didn't help. Ballads about noble thieves, stories of clever outlaws outwitting greedy lords. These tales romanticized the life, attracting new recruits who believed they, too, could become local heroes rather than corpses swinging at a crossroads. So the wolves endured, maybe fewer, maybe quieter, but still present in the shadows, reminding everyone that even as Europe changed, the fear of the road remained. In every dark forest, in every narrow pass, the traveler's old question survived the centuries. Who waits for me beyond the bend? Marco Polo's journey began not as a heroic quest, nor as a spiritual pilgrimage, but as something far more practical, the business trip of a lifetime. In the 13th century, merchants were the only Europeans who routinely stepped beyond familiar borders, navigating continents with little more than instinct, coin, and courage. Marco grew up in Venice, a city buzzing with sailors, spices, silk, foreign accents, and whispered tales of kingdoms beyond imagination. Yet, even in such a crossroads of cultures, nothing could prepare him for what he would encounter once he left the comfort of the Adriatic. His travels would not only record landscapes and wealth, but also reveal how different societies understood desire, hospitality, and human relationships. From the moment Marco, his father Niccolo, and his uncle Maffo, he crossed into the eastern Mediterranean and entered a world where customs changed like the light in the desert. In Venice, marriage was a contract between families and wealth, carefully negotiated and bound by church law. But the further east he traveled, the more he saw traditions that challenged everything he thought he knew. For example, among Persians, hospitality itself was a ritual, a sacred duty rooted in ancient codes of honor. A guest was to be fed, protected, and respected even if he was a stranger. And sometimes this hospitality went beyond just being nice to guests. It included offering comfort and friendship in ways that shocked Western sensibilities. Marco saw social structures in Armenia and Persia where marriage was both rigid and flexible. He saw arranged unions shaped by clan loyalty, but also looser customs like temporary marriages, which were completely new to Latin Europe. He wrote about households where having multiple wives or concubines was a sign of status, not scandal, for a Venetian who was raised under. This world was so fascinating, strange, and hard to resist that it was hard to describe. As Marco traveled deeper into Central Asia, crossing barren steppes and busy caravanserai, he saw Mongol and Turk traditions that blurred the line between family and duty, affection and alliance. In nomadic societies, women often had much more freedom than women in Europe. They managed herds, negotiated exchanges, and took part in social life. These roles shaped relationships in ways. Marco's journey across Persia was the first time he realized that love, marriage, and desire were not universal ideas, but cultural expressions. As he got closer to the great Khan's court, he felt that the most amazing discoveries were still to come. By the time Marco Polo crossed into Persia, he knew he had entered a world where hospitality was not just a polite gesture. It was a cultural performance, a sacred duty, and sometimes a dangerous temptation. Persian hosts believed a traveler carried not only dust and fatigue, but also divine favor. To welcome a guest was to honor God, to mistreat one was to invite shame. And Marco, a foreign merchant from a distant sea city, often found himself treated with an elegance that Venice reserved only for nobles. Persian hospitality began the moment a traveler approached a home or caravanserai. Marco described ornate carpets rolled out for guests, bowls of cool water for washing hands, and platters of. Marco never directly confessed to taking part. He was too diplomatic and too aware that Europeans would read his book. But he hints at great kindnesses, hosts who did everything right, and women who honored their guests. Readers in Venice could read these lines however they wanted. Those who knew Eastern customs understood perfectly. Marriage in Persia was even more complicated. Families carefully arranged marriages, negotiating dowries, property, and clan alliances. But strangely, temporary marriages existed alongside permanent ones. These short term unions lasted only a few days or months, were seen as legal and respectable in some places. This shocked Venetians. To Persians, it was just practical, based on hundreds of years of tradition. Concubinage was also common. Wealthy men kept concubines not just for pleasure, but also to grow their families, make sure they had heirs, and strengthen alliances. Marco was fascinated by how much power those women in these roles had in the home. They were not prisoners. Many were good at music, poetry, negotiation, and household management. Marco traveled from village to village, staying with merchants, nobles, and caravan leaders. He learned that relationships in Persia were fluid, layered, and deeply tied to ideas of honor and hospitality. A guest wasn't just fed, they were absorbed into the rhythm of the household. Marco, always the curious observer, wrote it all down with a mix of awe, restraint, and curiosity. Persia showed him that hospitality could be sensual, political, and deeply meaningful, human, and it got him ready for the even stranger customs that awaited him along the Silk Road. For Marco Polo, Persia was only the beginning. As he and his family traveled deeper along the Silk Road, the world around him turned into a living artery. Caravans stretched for miles, camels groaned beneath mountain winds, and travelers from every culture shared food, gossip, and desire under the same roof. This roof was the caravanserai, the great crossroads of Asia, where relationships were forged not through bloodlines, but through shared danger and survival. A caravanserai wasn't just an inn, it was a universe. Travelers from China, India, Arabia, Armenia, and Central Asia slept side by side in vast stone courtyards built like fortresses. Marco described them as large enclosures with strong gates, and those gates mattered. Once they closed at dusk, no one entered, no one left. Inside, the night became a swirl of humanity. Merchants bargaining late into the dark, cooks roasting meat over open fires, musicians plucking foreign, Instruments and storytellers told stories of deserts, demons, storms, and silk. Relationships here were based on need. The road was too dangerous to travel alone, so temporary brotherhoods formed. A Persian horse trader might team up with a Chinese silk merchant for protection. An Armenian pilgrim might join a Mongol caravan for safe passage. Marco learned quickly that alliances changed all the time. Today's protector could become tomorrow's rival. Yet every night, these alliances were strengthened through rituals, sharing bread, exchanging news, and engaging in the subtle dance of trust. Caravanserai life also carried an undercurrent of intimacy. Strangers thrown together often sought comfort in companionship. Women traveling with caravans for trade or service played crucial roles in maintaining the social life of the journey. Some were entertainers or musicians, others were servants who brought warmth to cold desert nights. Marco hints gently, never explicitly, at these encounters. He writes of women, skilled in pleasing conversation, of dances of the night, and of travelers who took solace from the hardships of the road. In a culture where loneliness meant vulnerability, such relationships were both emotional refuge and practical alliance. The economic world of the caravanserai was equally layered. Deals were made over wine, tea, or fermented mare's milk. Dowries, marriage arrangements, and informal betrothals sometimes emerged from these trading circles. A merchant might offer his daughter in marriage to seal a partnership, or two families might agree to future unions as part of a business pact. Through these encounters, Marco discovered that the Silk Road wasn't only a highway for goods, it was a highway for relationships. Friendships, romances, rivalries, and alliances flowed through its caravans, arise as richly as silks and spices. In this melting world, Marco began to understand the interconnectedness of Eurasia, a place where human bonds mattered as much as trade routes and where every night held the possibility of a new friend, a new story, or a new danger. Marco Polo crossed from Persia into the vast steppes of Central Asia and entered a society that changed almost everything a 13th century Venetian thought about gender, marriage, and relationships. In Venice, women lived mostly in seclusion, bound by dowries, church law, and the constant watch of male relatives. But on the steppe, in the lands of the Turks, Uyghurs, and early Mongol tribes, Marco found a world where women moved with a freedom that surprised him. European sensibilities. They rode horses, ran households, negotiated prices, and sometimes even had a say in tribal politics. Marriage among nomadic groups was less strict and more practical. Families did arrange marriages, but these were more flexible and based on survival and alliances than on strict religious rules. Among Turk groups, a bride brought not only beauty, but also work, horses, and connections. A skilled horse who could herd, fight, or manage livestock was valued as much as, if not more, than her physical beauty. Attributes. Marco describes Steppe W women with admiration, strong, confident, and unafraid to speak publicly, an image impossible to imagine in the patrician courts of Venice. polygamy was accepted, especially for chiefs and wealthy herders. A man with multiple wives wasn't seen as indulgent, but capable, able to support large households with food, tents, herds, and protection. In turn, wives often managed distinct camps within the family, giving them authority over servants, children, and resources. Marco saw that these women had real power, not just symbolic power. They decided how to divide up food, how to organize herds, and how to treat guests, who were very important. Hospitality in the steppe was sacred. Any traveler, even a stranger, was offered shelter, food, and protection. A guest became part of the family as long as he stayed under the roof. In some tribes, a guest was expected to join in communal rituals such as singing, telling stories, and drinking fermented mare's milk. Sharing in nightly gatherings around the fire. These gatherings blurred social boundaries, creating connections that were emotional as much as practical. Marco hints that companionship was sometimes offered to guests not as scandal or seduction, but as generosity, a way of honoring the visitor and strengthening social ties. Where Venice saw the body as bound by religious rules, the steppes saw it as part of life's natural rhythms. For Marco, Central Asia felt like a world where relationships were honest, direct, and intertwined. With survival, here, marriage wasn't a cage, but a partnership. Women were not hidden, but visible, and hospitality carried a sensual undertone that foreshadowed the even greater sophistication of the Mongol imperial courts he was about to enter. When Marco Polo finally entered Mongol controlled territory, he found himself stepping into a political world where relationships were not merely personal choices. They were instruments of governance. The Mongol Empire was the largest land empire in human history, and its leaders knew that marriage, lineage, and close ties were just as powerful as any army of horsemen. Every marriage, concubine, and household arrangement had a strategic purpose. The great Khan was at the center of this system, and his palace was full of attendants, wives, and women of rank. Marco describes these courts with awe. They were huge tent cities with silk hangings, carpets woven with golden thread, and rooms full of musicians, dancers, and servants. The women in the Khan's household were not just pretty faces. Many were chosen from noble families in conquered nations and given as gifts as part of diplomatic ties or through alliances that kept rival clans loyal. Concubinage was not seen as wrong. It was a smart way to keep unity among large groups of people. A concubine could improve her status by being smart, diplomatic, or having sons. Some ran whole wings of the palace, taking care of servants, finances, and political petitions. Marco said that these women were trained in etiquette, music, and conversation, and that they moved through the palace with a calm authority that surprised him. In Venice, such influence would be scandalous. In the Mongol world, it was expected marriage among the Mongols themselves followed clear customs. Brides were often chosen to strengthen intertribal relationships, and marriage negotiations included exchanges of animals, silk, and weapons. Women retained notable rights they could own: property, manage herds, and start certain legal processes. Their ability to move around, ride, travel, and work together was unmatched in Western Europe. Marco found Mongol women to be confident, outspoken, and important to both home and political life. Hospitality was very important in this area. Marco wrote that guests of the Khan were welcomed with lavish banquets, endless cups of fermented mare's milk, and entertainment by women trained in dance and song. Some households even offered companionship to guests as a gesture of high honor, something difficult for Westerners to write openly about. Marco, cautious yet observant, noted attentions given to him and other travelers, implying moments of intimacy without ever crossing into explicit confession. What impressed him most was how pragmatic, structured, and dignified these relationships were. Far from the moral rigidity of the Catholic West, the Mongol court embraced sensuality, diplomacy, and family alliances as elements of a single political system. To Marco, it was a world where personal relationships and imperial strategy were woven together, delicate as silk and powerful as steel, a world he had never imagined before his journey began. When Marco Polo finally reached Kath, the lands ruled by the Song remnants in the south and by the great Kun's Yuan dynasty in the north, he stepped into a world unlike anything he had witnessed in Persia or the steppe. If the Mongols impressed him with power and pragmatism, the Chinese courts astonished him with refinement. Everything in Kath seemed planned: the buildings, the poetry, the manners, the scents, and even the way people walked and talked. Relationships here were not wild or instinctual like in the steppes. They were choreographed, measured, subtle, and deeply sensual in their restraint. Marco was struck by the differences between Chinese marriage customs and those in Venice, where dowries and strict family honor were important. In Kath, harmony was more important. Families, astrologers, and matchmakers carefully arranged marriages. Compatibility was important. Auspicious birthdays were important. Even the balance of yin and yang was important. A good match wasn't just about money, it was also about making a home where everyone got along. Marco was interested in the role of women. Elite women lived in defined domestic spheres, but they were very well educated in poetry, music, calligraphy, and etiquette. Their influence was indirect but strong. A skilled woman could host, entertain, and advise her husband, which raised the status of the whole family. Household's prestige. Marco admired their grace, their artistry, and the way they appeared to move with effortless composure. Then there were the courtesans, women trained in refined conversation, music, and poetry, who entertained merchants and nobles in tea houses or private gardens. Unlike concubines in Mongol courts, courtesans in Kath were cultural performers serving as symbols of urban sophistication. Marco describes gatherings where courtesans played stringed instruments, recited verses, and exchanged witty banter with guests. Intimacy here was intellectual as much as physical. A meaningful glance or a whispered poem carried more weight than bold displays of affection. Concubinage existed as well, but carried less political weight than in Mongol society. Wealthy men kept concubines to secure lineage, manage households, or simply enjoy companionship. Yet, even concubines were expected to master etiquette, poetry, and household arts. Their presence added layers of complexity to family relationships. But the focus was still on keeping peace within the group rather than showing who was in charge. In Cath, hospitality combined sensuality with elegance. A guest might be welcomed with incense, warm tea, silken cushions, and soft music playing behind lattice screens. Marco was struck by how well the Chinese combined an emotional, intellectual, and physical comfort, as if they had mastered not only the art of living, but also the art of making a guest feel deeply, almost dangerously at ease.